Our focus standard for this lesson comes from Grade 8 Expressions and Equations, Standard C, Analyze and Solve Linear Equations. So today we're starting a new unit, and thus the reason for a new standard. And so our new unit and the topic for this lesson is going to be simplifying and solving equations. So that's going to be the unit that we focus on. And our first lesson is called Expressions versus Equations and Related Vocab. Our essential question for today is, what is the proper terminology to use when working with expressions and equations? So please take a moment to pause the video if you need to and set up your header. Be sure to copy this all down along with today's date, set up your question column and your note column, and resume the video when you're ready to begin. We're going to start out making a Venn diagram. I know it doesn't look like a Venn diagram, but you'll want to complete yours here, talking about equations and expressions. So the biggest thing about an equation is that it has an equal sign, and an expression doesn't. An expression has no equal sign. But what they have in common is they have terms, which I'm going to define here in a moment, operations, so you see things like these symbols here. They have grouping symbols to bring things together, such as parentheses, brackets, or fractions. Remember a fraction bar, which goes between the numerator and denominator. Sometimes they'll put a group of items in the numerator or the denominator. And so those things can exist in either an equation or an expression, but the biggest difference is that an equation has an equal sign and an expression doesn't. So I've talked about terms, but there's a few vocabulary words then that are important to recognize about expressions and equations. So some helpful vocabulary is first variable. So a variable is a letter that represents an unknown value. We use them all the time in algebra. A term is a number, a variable, or the product of a number and variables. So a product of a number and a variable would be like when you see a number and a variable written right next to each other with no operation sign in between them. And terms in either an equation or an expression are separated by operation and grouping symbols. Here's an example. In the expression 1 2/10 x plus 56 minus 3xy squared, the terms, which are all these parts that are separated by operation symbols, are 1 2/10 x, 56, and negative 3xy squared. This is what we mean by the product of a number and variables. So we have a number, an integer, -3, the variable x, and the variable y squared. And all of those are together. They're not separated by any kind of parentheses or an operation sign, so that gets taken together as a term. You might also know that we took the subtraction sign and gave that to the 3 because the signs in front of a term tell you whether it's positive or whether it's negative. So 56 is positive because it has a plus sign in front of it, and the 3xy squared is negative because it has a negative sign. It has the subtraction sign in front of it. A coefficient is a number multiplying a variable or products of variables. Coefficients are signified by writing the number directly in front of the variable or variables. And we've already seen that, but let's look at a specific example for this. -7 would be the coefficient of the term -7xy. So when we see this term, -7 is the coefficient. Up here, -3 would be the coefficient because it's the number being multiplied by the variables. And 1 2/10 would be the coefficient because it's the number being multiplied by x, and there is no operation signs between them. So please take a moment to make sure that you have your Venn diagram and this helpful vocabulary with the definitions and examples copied into your notes. And then I have just a few more problems for us to look at. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Here are 3 sets of problems, and what I'd like you to do for each problem is label if it's an expression or an equation. You could do that just by writing it down or circling it, and list each term and or coefficient. So you do want an answer box like this, and so we want to go through and look at each one and say, is it an equation or an expression? List the terms and list the coefficients. So we're going to do that for all 3. We can do this first one with you. It has an equal sign, so it would be an equation. So maybe get rid of this. And the terms, it looks to me like there are 4 of them. What do you think? You said 6x squared would be one of them. Negative 2x would be 1. 3 and 0. Those are all terms. And then our coefficients would be 6 and negative 2. So I actually wrote that here. So it's an equation. 6x squared, negative 2x, 3 and 0 are all the terms. That's where we see separations using symbols. And then the coefficients, which are the numbers in front or being multiplied by a variable. So we had x squared as a variable, 6 is its coefficient, and we had x here as a variable, and negative 2 is its coefficient. And remember that subtraction sign tells us that that 2 is negative, and that would be important if we were going to substitute a value in. So go ahead and take a moment to look at the next 2 problems and see if you can do the same thing we just did for this first one. Decide if it's an equation or an expression, list out the terms and the coefficients. And then, so I'd pause the video to do that and then resume the video to check your work with mine. Alright, so for number 2 we have 3x plus 5y. There is no equal sign, so it is an expression. And so I'll uncover my answers here. The terms are 3x and 5y, because that's where we see the symbol dividing the 2. The coefficients are 3 and 5, because those are the 2 different numbers being multiplied by a variable. The 3 is being multiplied by x, and the 5 is being multiplied by y. So it was an expression because there's no equal sign. It had 2 terms and 2 coefficients. So let's see about the third one. I do see an equal sign, so that means it's an equation. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 terms, 1/3 x, 4, x, and 2. Because that is all the places where it is separated by an symbol. And the coefficient, there's only one of them, and it's 1/3, because this x variable is being multiplied by 1/3. And if you want to be really tricky, you could say that there's a 1 right here being multiplied by that x, but we don't normally count that. So that concludes our video here on equations versus expressions. Again, make sure your notes are complete. Then start writing your own study guide questions. Then summarizing your answer to those study guide questions down here in the summary.